Peter Singer is with us. He is a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. His 1975 book, Animal Liberation, is considered to be a founding text on the contemporary animal rights movement. For years, he's had opinions on subjects from euthanasia for disabled infants to the war in Iraq. His new book takes on fighting world poverty. It's called The Life You Can Save. I am pleased to have Peter Singer back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
How do you choose, A, what you're going to write books about, B, what's going to be the focus of your time and energy and considerable intellectual acumen?
There are a number of issues that I've worked on over the years. You mentioned some of them, but this question of the obligations of the affluent to the world's poor has in fact been something I first wrote about in 1972, one of my first academic publications. And ever since then I've been thinking about it, and people have responded to that original article. And I just think in a way it was maturing within me, the idea that this should be the next topic that I write a book on, because I really hadn't said enough on it. It's such an important issue, and I felt it was time to say more than just a couple of articles.
So, but when you think about these things, I mean, do you get interested in them?
Oh, yes.
These subjects that have some popular appeal.
They have popular appeal, but they actually have a lot of philosophical interest as well. You know, what are the obligations? That's an ethical question. We tend to assume that if you obey the rules about not stealing, cheating, killing, and so on, that you've led an ethical life. But is that right? So those are the kinds of, that's where the philosophical interest comes in.
But when you look at these subjects, do you say to yourself, something's missing here? There's something that hasn't been said. There is a direction that has been untraveled.
Definitely. I felt that there was something askew with our ordinary moral standards that can condemn people for infractions of those rules, but not in any way require them to do something when they easily can help people in poverty. And I thought that's something that needs to be discussed and got out there.
As you sat down, I said the following: there's a whole range of smart people who believe we can and should do something about world poverty, but our record is miserable.
It is. It is.
Does that say something about the power of the ideas or something else?
I think the ideas are as powerful as any ideas can be, but what it shows is that when even very powerful ideas push up against something as basic to us as our own self-interest, and as the way in which our society reinforces that self-interest and channels it into directions that make business profitable, it's very hard for more purely ethical or intellectual ideas to push back against that.
It depends on how you define self-interest.
That's true, of course, because I really think, in fact, it would be in our own interest, broadly conceived, to do a lot more for the poor than we do. I think we'd find it more fulfilling than just spending more on consumer goods. So what I should have said is push against that narrower notion of self-interest that we have in this society, and again, that I think is fostered by those who seek to profit from it.
I mean, you can't make an argument that the world needs poor for any reason, can you? Unless it's employment, and that doesn't seem to ring true.
I mean, there was a Marxist argument that you need to have this army of poor labourers to do the work cheaply.
Yeah, right.
But I don't think that's true, because, I mean, America has actually functioned quite well without poverty, and a number of other countries have. And I can't see that the poverty of people elsewhere in the world was essential to the prosperity of those
or globalization or whatever.
No, I don't think so.
So that's not an argument. What's the argument for people being poor? I mean, whose interest is it for people to be poor?
I don't think that it's in anyone's interest for there to be 1 billion people in poverty in the world. It may be in the interest of some repressive governments to keep their people poor and ignorant so that they can stay in power and exploit them. But that's not, that's not the whole cause of poverty, because there are people who are poor in countries that have decent governments but lack resources.
So what's the problem?
I think the problem is that people get trapped into poverty. They can't get out of it because they don't have the resources to pull out of it and participate in the global economy, which has been beneficial for hundreds of millions of people in China and India, say. And they need a help up. They need some assistance to get into the 21st century, to get decent conditions where they can have some security, that they can bring up their children, that they can even educate their children. I think that's important. And then gradually they can get into the global economy and they can participate and at least escape from the extreme poverty that they're in.
Because I'm looking for a powerful argument beyond it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, beyond the idea of making you feel good, beyond the idea of it's the moral thing to do.
Right. Well, obviously, I do think it's the right thing to do.
Well, all those things are very important. I'm not minimizing them, but I'm looking for the other argument.
Yeah. I think the other argument is that we will be living in a world that is better for us in the long run if we have a world without poverty. You know, so much poverty clearly breeds resentment. It can breed violence and hostility. It can also, in some circumstances, lead to floods of refugees, and especially with climate change combined with poverty, that could get much worse than anything we've seen. That could become overwhelming for some countries. There's also problems about diseases and pandemics. We have a lot of the people's world living in countries without any kind of real health system, without any monitoring of what's happening. And yet these diseases, once they get started, we've seen them, they can spread very rapidly. So I think it's in all of our interests if we live in a world which is more stable and does not have a billion people just struggling to get their next meal or to survive for the next day.
The side of the world, whatever portion of the world that has done well, needs to do more for all the reasons you've cited, but are there any incentives to make them do it?
Well, in some countries, of course, you have an educated public which thinks this is important, and so the governments have an incentive because the voters care about it. I wish we were like that. I wish that the amount of foreign aid we give and the efficiency of the foreign aid we give had been more of an issue at the last election.
Why wasn't it?
I don't think anybody really wanted to make it an issue. I mean, President Obama had as a candidate some good policies to increase foreign aid, but he never really talked about it. It was on the website, you could find it. But I watched all of the debates in vain to hear him mention this as an important reason for voting for him. I think he was worried, maybe he had some focus groups saying this is not what people are really going to vote for.
Yeah, it's probably not, in the judgment of political strategists, the most effective way to get votes is to say to people, give me your money so that I can give it to another country.
But it's interesting that in, say, Scandinavian countries, that does seem to work. People seem to support the idea that foreign aid is a national responsibility. If
it's an issue in their electoral campaigns?
Yeah.
Or it's just the nature of the people they choose to elect have that predisposition?
Sometimes in some countries it's actually been an issue. I mean, I'm not saying it's been the dominant issue, but it has been an issue that's been discussed about whether we're doing enough, whether we should do more, or do it in a different way.
Take me through what you think are the misconceptions about aid.
Well, the biggest misconception is how much aid we give. I quote in the book some quite amusing polls where you ask people whether they think the US should give more aid or less aid or about the same amount, and quite a lot of Americans say we should give less. And then you say...
And why do they say it?
Why do they say it? Well, this is... Let me continue.
Okay.
Then you say to them, how much of the federal budget, of federal government spending, do you think should go on foreign aid? And they say something like 5% or 10%. Now, what that shows is they're saying we should give less, but actually less than 1% of the federal budget goes on foreign aid. So they've obviously got some idea in their heads that a much larger percentage of the federal budget goes on foreign aid than really does. And if you ask them how much, they name a figure that's 5 to 10 times as much as is really given, and they think that's less. So there's a huge ignorance gap, I think, in the American public as to how much of our government spending goes to other countries.
How big is the impression that there's so much corruption that the money never reaches the people intended for?
That's something I've come across again and again. Undoubtedly, that idea is out there. Of course, there have been the odd scandals, but I think the problem here is that something makes news and it sticks in people's head, and then for years things go by without a scandal. Aid operates reasonably effectively, again, especially the non-government agencies. And nobody notices that. It's not newsworthy that an organisation worked well for a year, and so people have completely off-beam ideas of how much waste there is in this area. And I'm not saying there is no waste, but I'm saying any big human enterprise, you've got to expect that some things are going to go wrong sometimes. And I think the record of the non-government agencies for aid is really generally a pretty good one.
Yeah, Bill Gates makes that same argument, I think. So
absolutely.
what about people like Gates and other huge philanthropic institutions?
I really admire Bill Gates for what he's done. I think he and Warren Buffett have been leaders in not only giving a huge amount of money, but also in saying our priorities should be the world's poor. They should be to improve global health, not just, say, to put more medical research into the diseases that strike us, because we've already put a lot in and it's really expensive to make further progress. But they're saying, look, there's 2 million children dying every year from diarrhea. That's something that we already know how to cure. We've just got to get the means out there, and we can prevent it. So they're looking at picking the low-hanging fruit. Where are the lives that can be cheaply saved? And I think that's absolutely the right priorities.
And what's your criticism of people like Larry Ellison and Paul Allen?
Well, Larry Ellison and Paul Allen are, almost as wealthy as Gates. They've certainly got several billions even after the downturn. And yet they're not putting
more
money.
than several.
Yeah, right. They're not putting money into these issues. I mean, they've both done some philanthropy, but it's basically philanthropy in the arts, or Paul Allen owns sports teams.
Yeah, no, Paul Allen does more. I mean, I just take one example, and I don't know a whole lot about either of them, but I do. Paul Allen is, I think, a fair amount of money research into brain stuff, and he's very interested. But it has to do more with subjects that interest them.
Right. That's right.
And Allen specifically is interested in brain research and brain science.
Yeah, and that may have good consequences in the long run. But I feel that if you have that much wealth, you have some responsibility to put some of it into helping the world's poorest, who were just not so lucky as you. You have to face it, really. These people were very lucky. They were in the right place at the right time. I mean, Paul Allen's a great example because he happened to go to high school with Bill Gates and they co-founded Microsoft. Sure, there's a lot of work and a lot of intelligence, but people with similar work in a different country could still be very poor.
I've raised that question with Bill Gates, and Bill Gates is the first to say that Paul Allen actually deserved a lot of credit for the success of Microsoft. It wasn't that he simply was a friend and therefore benefited from Bill's extraordinary talent. They did it together.
Sure, but he hasn't put back in anything like the way that Bill has.
And therefore, his most admired philanthropist, I guess. I mean, he certainly will be probably the most admired philanthropist in a long time, will he not? When you consider the total impact of what he might achieve.
The total impact, and of course he's not just putting money in, though he's putting a vast amount of money.
Exactly.
He's putting his own intelligence and efforts into making sure this works well. That's different from just writing a check and handing it over to other people.
What do you make of this person who's getting a bit of attention named Dambisa Boyer?
Right. I've read her work.
Her book is called Dead Aid, I think.
Yes, it is. And it's a strong critique of government aid and aid from multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. And she thinks that they have made governments and people dependent on aid and that that's a bad thing. And she may have a point there. But she does say right at the beginning that she is not talking about the non-government agencies. She's exempting them from the criticisms that she's making in the rest of the book. And I think that's important because I think they are more aware of these big problems of just handing money over to governments, and the governments, therefore, in a sense, not being so accountable to their people because they have this outside source of revenue.
The book is called The Life You Can Save, Acting Now to End World Poverty, Peter Singer. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. It's been really good talking to you.
Pleasure. Back in a moment. Stay with us.